It's a priority in this parish. We need more teaching, and we have asked the rector to do that. That's support from the vestry. Clergy need to be willing to be direct about that. And I believe that the clergy need to be upfront and direct about talking about their own giving. Worked in one congregation where the rector was saying quite seriously that he felt that his silent witness, if you will, about his own giving was quite effective, that people well understood him to be a generous person, and that his pledge was, and the level of commitment, if not the dollar value, was well understood in the congregation. At which point the junior warden turned to him and said, "You mean you give to the church?" And all of a sudden he realized that his silent witness was not nearly as effective as he thought it was. We need to be willing to be open and direct. And I choose in our congregation to say directly how many dollars that I give to the parish. I could simply talk about percentages, because you don't have to be a financial genius to go to the bulletin board, look at the parish budget, and calculate it out. But I find that it's good for me to be willing to be that open and clear and direct about what I give. It is also very clearly an attention getter in the sense of what people's response to it is, "My golly, he means business. This is real for him." And the response that I have gotten as I've talked about my own giving in our congregation has been universal, positive response that I didn't realize what this could be in my life. And you talking about what it has meant in your life and how you've struggled with it and avoided it and how you have responded to it has made a difference to me. It has made it easier for me to respond. I don't think people run away from a call to commitment. And I think a lot of times the clergy get fearful. We try to protect our people from any kind of adverse reaction to the gospel. And I'm afraid that we often are softeners of the gospel by our concern that perhaps somebody might hear more than they're ready to accept today. My experience that if the gospel is presented in a non-judgmental, accepting way, people hear it and feel challenged by it, even if they're not in a position to respond to it at that time. People respond much more positively to a call to commitment than they do to some kind of manipulative arm twist, some kind of fundraising effort to coerce it out of them. There's a wonderful cartoon in Leadership magazine recently that showed the rector being greeted by people at the door after the sermon, and the rector greeting them. And two parishioners are stopping and saying, "We were so thrilled to hear you say that you had no idea where the money was going to come from for the building program. For a minute we were afraid you thought it was going to come from us." And there's a sense in which people are so used to that kind of arm twist, that kind of fundraising appeal, that people are struck when clergy are willing to get up and talk about their own life and their own giving. So the first principle is leadership. A, clergy. B, vestry. Our canons are quite clear in this diocese that the vestry shares in the spiritual leadership of the parish. That the, what I feel was disastrous, but fortunately now long gone, distinction between the spiritual leadership of the clergy and the temporal leadership of the vestry has disappeared. That the clergy are called to share in their spiritual leadership of the congregation with the vestry, and the vestry is called to assume their rightful place in leading the parish in spiritual matters. It is indeed the business of the vestry to talk about spiritual things, to talk about the place of Jesus Christ in their lives and the claim that God has on their parish. And what are we going to do about that? And as congregations are willing to look at these issues, the place to begin is with the vestry. And for the vestry to say, where are we as stewards, and what will we say to this parish? Because they're part of that leadership. In our way of being as Episcopalians, it is generally true that not much is going to happen in the congregation over the dead body of the rector. The rector support is crucial, the vestry's support is also crucial. Some things the rector can accomplish by preaching and generally changing the climate of the congregation without the support of the vestry. But generally the parish does not begin to in any way take off in a kind of united way in one direction until the vestry is committed to the same principles, until the vestry is willing to be out front. Generally what vestries say to stewardship leaders, and there are many of them present, the wardens being in Richmond, I can say this, the vestry says, we haven't the faintest idea what we believe about Christian stewardship. We're generally uncomfortable with the subject. We don't know what we think about things like the tithe. And then turns to the stewardship chairperson for the year and says, now will you please teach that to the parish? Right? On purely management level, we have to say that policy, in this case theology, principles, is a decision for the leadership body, for the vestry. And then in turn that vestry should say, here is what we are committed to. This is what we are about as a church. Now, Stewardship Committee, will you please help us educate the congregation and change the congregation to follow more clearly these principles that we adhere to? It is unfair and inappropriate and doomed to failure for the vestry to say, we don't believe it, but please teach it, and when anybody gets upset about it, we promise to cut you off at the knees by saying, well, we didn't ask him to say that. And unfortunately, that happens all too often in churches, and that's why if you call Barbara Salisbury and want her to come in and train your stewardship callers, she will say, no, we would rather come in and meet with your vestry, because we want to do some teaching up front with your leadership and help them to come to a place of commitment. Because what the primary step that we are seeking in leadership commitment from the vestry is a unanimous statement from the clergy and the vestry about their own giving, including a statement of their support of the biblical tithe as a minimum standard for their own giving. That becomes the crux issue for so many groups, that until that issue has been dealt with and resolved, everything else becomes, is hung up out of lack of clarity about that. When the vestry deals with that issue directly and is willing to put itself on the line to the congregation that this is where we are, then that teaching can be carried out in the congregation at large. But please don't call us to come into your church and teach things that you don't believe. And to put it simply, that's the issue. We are thrilled to come in and help you as leadership articulate your belief and your commitment. And if we, in fact, are on the same wavelength and your commitment meshes with our commitment, we would be thrilled to help you teach that to the congregation. But in my experience in the Episcopal Church is that you can find some kook to come into your church and say anything. And I think most people know that. And just having somebody come in and say what people in your congregation are reluctant to say is not going to change anything. It's an exercise in frustration. Change happens when the commitment comes from your own people. And so we ask to come in and meet with your whole vestry. Having 100% attendance at a vestry meeting is a landmark event for a lot of congregations. And we're not rigid about that in some authoritarian kind of way. It's just simply our experience that the vestry needs to experience this teaching together and struggle with it together. And so we ask you to set up 2 dates when the entire vestry can be present for some stewardship teaching and discussion. Times when the whole vestry will be there to struggle with all of this. And when people get sick, we say that's fine. We'll be happy to reschedule that meeting. And when someone arranges to work late because the subject for the meeting is stewardship, we say we're fine, we're happy to reschedule. And in my experience is that there are 2 different kinds of people. One who, because they don't want to deal with stewardship, will miss the meeting. And we say, this is something that will not go on without you. You can't avoid this one. The vestry needs your input and leadership. By the same token, the person who sincerely had to be out of town or got sick, who calls to miss, is told this issue is crucial and your participation is so important that we postponed it because we cannot go on without you. And in my experience, most members of vestries have never been told that they mattered that much to the leadership of their parish. And our experience is that by the time the vestry is fully present to meet and talk about these issues, We're halfway there in terms of raising the point of the leadership of the vestry. That point has been made just in how we gather the group. And the vestry begins to realize that their leadership is important and that they have a spiritual role on issues like this in the congregation. And then we teach and help the vestry try to articulate its leadership and come to some understanding about its own stewardship principles and own stewardship practice, and to commend that to the congregation. It is not a prideful thing. It is simply to say, we invite you, the parish, to do what we are already personally committed to. And that's what leadership is all about. No one likes to be told to go do something, but people respond when they are invited to follow. I learned that from my dog. My dog does not understand the word come. It is a non-comprehensible word in his vocabulary. If you say in the backyard, come, he will look at you. What he thinks is the word come, and what he will respond to is the phrase, let's go, said in an upbeat tone of voice. And I realize that that's exactly the way I am. I don't like to be ordered to come, but I do like to follow leaders who say, let's go. And my sense is that that's what people in our churches need to hear from us. They need that let's go. We are committed in this area of stewardship, and we invite you to join with us. And that is a very different thing than most of us have experienced from the vestry. If the vestry is clear about its spiritual leadership, if the clergy and vestry are clear that the standard for Christian giving is the tithe, then in general, I would suggest that the budget be done after the pledges. And I'll explain that in a minute. Now, let me give the exception first. The exception to that is if your vestry arrives at its budget in a way that is prayerfully listening to the Lord to hear what God is calling us to do, and we believe that God has directed us to this budget for the coming year, then I say God bless you. My experience, however, is that 99.9% of the churches that determine their budget first are simply adding up what they have to keep the place going. And it has nothing whatsoever to do with a God-given directive about what the budget should be in the coming year. I am encouraging those churches who are simply used to adding up what we have to have for the coming year to think about waiting on the budget until after the pledges are in, for the following reason. Most people in churches of the kind of traditional stewardship approach have people in it who calculate their pledge for the coming year by looking at the change in the budget. Places where there has not been extensive education about tithing, about Thanksgiving, about that kind of response, look at the budget and see the budget has gone up 11%, and realize, if they're not explicitly told by the treasurer or someone, I should give 11% more than last year. And a lot of our people have come to make their decisions about giving in response to the budget and not in response to their own personal income. And as soon as we provide the budget, we make it possible for people to do that. And to get up and say everybody should give 11% more than last year is usually a very inappropriate thing, because we've got parishes have two extremes. We have the stereotypical poor tithing widow who didn't get an 11% raise last year, who has now been led to feel guilty because she's not paying her fair share because she can't give 11% more than she did last year. And we've got the other person who makes $100,000 a year and is giving $100 and is going to give $111 next year and feel great because he did his fair share. It's not an appropriate standard. When I talk at clergy conferences and things about all of this, I share sometimes that one person that I knew came up to me and always had a fetish to know in the fall how many households we had in the church. And I never understood that until I finally, in talking with him further, realized that what he was doing was finding out what number to divide into the budget in order to get his fair share. And as soon as I share that story with clergy, usually there are 3 or 4 clergy in the room who go, that's it, because they've got them too. People who are looking to calculate out their giving based on the budget.